Well, from what we're hearing in Tel Aviv, they do plan to strike Iran again. So obviously, the deterrence that was necessary to be established has not been established if this attack takes place, if this escalation takes place. And the Iranians have already promised that if the regime attacks Iran, they will hit back much harder next time round. So this is a lose-lose situation for the Israeli regime, and I think they know it. But Netanyahu is desperate. He's lost on the battlefield. On the border with Lebanon, things have not gone well over the last 8 days. He's lost over the last year, both in Gaza and on the border with Lebanon and in the Red Sea with regards to Ansarullah, despite U.S. help. And the only way that he can save himself is through an escalation where the United States enters the battle. That's what I think he's trying to do.
Joining me in the studio, as usual, is our resident expert, David Miller, who's widely regarded as the UK's preeminent scholarly critic of Israel. David's a senior research fellow at the Centre for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Zayim University, and is a co-director of the lobbying watchdog Spinwatch. Joining us again as our guest contributor today is the academic and political analyst, Professor Mohammed Marandi. He's built up a reputation recently for shredding hostile Western media interviewers, and we're delighted that he's joined us today. In his day job, he's a professor of English literature and Orientalism at the University of Tehran. Welcome to the show. Professor Marandi, leaders of Western countries have castigated Iran for its recent operation against Israel, haven't they? But from where I'm sitting, it looked like Iran was acting in self-defense.
Yes, definitely. The West knows this too. In fact, the Israeli regime has been carrying out attacks on Iran for many years with Western support. The first attack was when the United States and the Israelis carried out a cyber attack on Iran's nuclear program many years ago. After that, they worked together to assassinate a number of Iranian scientists, including a colleague of mine at the University of Tehran who was murdered in front of his wife. And then a deputy minister of defense was also assassinated. And Iranian officers in Syria who were fighting against ISIS and Al-Qaeda, they were also repeatedly targeted because the Israeli regime was supporting these extremist groups and terror groups in Syria. So this goes back a long way. It's a one-sided act of constant acts of aggression that we're seeing. But then more recently, they bombed the Iranian embassy in Damascus. The West supported them at they supported the Israeli regime at the UN Security Council. And so Iran was forced to retaliate. And then again, the Israeli regime carried out an act of aggression by murdering martyr Ismail Haniyeh, the political head of Hamas, who was an official guest of the president for his inauguration. And they murdered him in an official government guest house. So the Iranians again struck back. All of this is legitimate. All of this was brought about to create deterrence. But the West has consistently supported the regime in carrying out acts of aggression. And every time Iran responds, Iran is condemned.
David, is it significant in your opinion that Iran focused its attacks on military targets in Israel?
Well, it's hugely significant. Of course, what happened was that information was given to the Americans, and there was a discussion with the Americans, between the Iranians and the Americans, about what would be targeted and what wouldn't be targeted. And that, in effect, allowed the Zionists a leeway of 2 hours. And the agreement was that they would attack military targets only and that they wouldn't kill any civilians. And there was an accidental killing of one Palestinian civilian. But there seems to have been no other casualties at all, which is an extraordinarily small rate of human attrition for the level of attack that there was, which were almost all of the missiles, not all of them, but almost all of them, hit their targets. Most of them got through, so one or two got stopped by Jordan, but the missiles got through, they hit almost precisely the targets in the Tel Nof air base, in the Nevatim air base, and indeed at Mossad HQ north of Tel Aviv.
Huge contrast to the Zionist occupation forces for sure. But Professor Marandi, I mean, we know that Iran managed to land a large number of direct strikes in Israel, as David was just pointing out there. But will that be a sufficient deterrent, in your opinion, against the rogue Zionist entity?
Well, from what we're hearing in Tel Aviv, they do plan to strike Iran again. So obviously, the deterrence that was necessary to be established uh, has not been established if this attack takes place, if this escalation takes place. And the Iranians have already promised that if the regime attacks Iran, they will hit back much harder next time round. So this is a lose-lose situation for the Israeli regime, and I think they know it. But Netanyahu is desperate. He's lost on the battlefield, on the border with Lebanon. Things have not gone well over the last 8 days. He's lost over the last year, both in Gaza and on the border with Lebanon and in the Red Sea with regards to Ansarullah, despite U.S. help. And the only way that he can save himself is through an escalation where the United States enters the battle. That's what I think he's trying to do. Otherwise, in any exchange, in any military exchange with Iran, Iran has the upper hand. Iran has hundreds of thousands of missiles and hundreds of thousands of drones in a large number of underground missile and drone cities. These were prepared for a potential U.S. attack on Iran, and they were built after the United States invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. So they were created for a much more powerful potential adversary. Israel is nothing compared to the United States. It's completely dependent on the United States and the West. So if there is an exchange, the Israeli regime will be on the losing end. Their people will be demoralized, and the resistance in Gaza, the West Bank, the Red Sea, and Lebanon will feel even more empowered.
David, what impact then do you think Iran's hypersonic missiles have had on Israel's air defence capabilities?
Well, this seems to have been an attack like Operation True Promise number 1 to demonstrate that Iran can hit whatever it wants at will, and it demonstrated that pretty clearly. But what happens in relation to the air defence, I mean, let's remember that it's not just the Iron Dome. People think that the Israelis have only got the Iron Dome. They've got several different methods of air defence. They also rely on the Jordanian air defence system, and indeed on air defences of the American military off the shore in the Mediterranean, and none of them worked. So all of these missiles were able to get through and almost pinpoint accuracy, hit the targets that they wanted to get. So what's being said here is we can hit any target at will whenever we want. But the key question here, though, is if you recall what happened before in Operation True Promise 1, was there was a whole series of drones were sent up as decoys, and the Israelis
on the show.
The Israelis were saying, oh, well, look, most of the missiles didn't even hit. Well, of course, these were decoys which were intended, they sent several waves of them, intended to pick out the locations of the Iron Dome and other air defence mechanisms so they could be targeted, and also to evade them. And of course, that's what happened again. So the key question, though, is for the Iron Dome is if you shoot missiles at it from more than one position, including more than one part of Iran, then it becomes overwhelming because it doesn't know where to look.
Yeah, right. No, indeed. Well, Professor Marandi, in our first report, Latifa mentioned that Iran's actions were also about genocide prevention. Now, surely the United Nations responsibility to protect doctrine requires every country to take similar action to Iran, doesn't it? Or at least to support what Iran is trying to do in terms of bringing an end to the genocide being perpetrated by the Zionist regime.
The UN is not a credible body. It is losing its relevance very rapidly. It was created by the United States and the West, and they have controlled it since the Second World War. Structurally, the UN is deeply, deeply flawed, and it is not redeemable, at least not under current circumstances. And I think that with the rise of alternative global institutions or bodies like BRICS, or regional ones like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, we're going to increasingly see parallel bodies in different areas grow as well. And in the coming years and decades, I think the UN will become increasingly irrelevant unless there is some major reform that takes place, which at this stage it is really impossible to conceive such a thing happening. But it's the UN is a useless body, and so are all institutions that are linked to the UN in one way or another. The United States and the West will not allow justice to be served when it comes to their allies, and they will use the body to harm their adversaries, even if they, the West, are the aggressive side.
Well, our next report examines the consolidation of Iran's steadfast support for the resistance against the Zionist entity.
Iran's steadfast support for resistance against Israel is becoming clearer by the day, after a long period of patient restraint in the face of Zionist atrocities and assassinations. Operation True Promise 2 came after repeated miscalculations by the Zionist regime. One significant moment was the assassination of Dr. Ismail Haniyeh, chairman of the Hamas Political Bureau. On July 31st this year, Haniyeh was assassinated by the Zionist regime while staying at a guest house in the Iranian capital city of Tehran, after traveling there for the inauguration of President Masoud Pezeshkian. At the time, the IRGC vowed that the Zionist entity would receive a severe punishment at the appropriate time, place, and manner. And the catalyst for that retaliation came on the 27th of September, with the assassination of Syed Hassan Nasrallah, who had led the Lebanese resistance group Hezbollah for over 3 decades. The strike on Nasrallah also killed Brigadier General Abbas Nilfurushan, who had served as the IRGC's deputy of operations. Nasrallah had a significant personal following across West Asia and was admired by millions as an anti-colonial hero for his role in confronting Zionist aggression. His leadership was instrumental in Hezbollah's military successes. In the year 2000, Hezbollah played a central role in driving out Zionist forces from South Lebanon after an 18-year occupation. Nasrallah's popularity was further cemented in 2006 when Hezbollah defeated Israel after a month-long war. Under his command, Hezbollah had grown into the most powerful non-state military force in West Asia, with tens of thousands of troops and a formidable arsenal of short and long-range missiles. And since October 7th last year, Hezbollah has fought in solidarity with Palestinians, keeping large parts of the Israel occupation forces busy on the northern front. Hezbollah's missile attacks have forced around 70,000 Zionist settlers to flee from their colonial outposts in the north of occupied Palestine. Israel has repeatedly promised to return its settlers to the region, but it has been unable to do so after failing to degrade Hezbollah's operational capabilities. Israel's policy of assassinations has caused an inevitable reaction from Iran, and the country remains poised to retaliate further if necessary. The Zionist regime has promised to engage in more hostile actions against Iran, but Israel's Western allies have cautioned them to not go too far, given Iran's significant deterrent capabilities. While the immediate future remains uncertain, it is clear that the Zionist regime's aggression has crossed all red lines.
Professor Marandi, we heard in the film there that the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah was a major catalyst for Iran's response. I wonder whether you could explain for our viewers just how significant a figure he was.
Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah was a great hero, a towering figure, a very humble man, highly intelligent, very well educated, and someone who fought for the Palestinian cause perhaps more than any other in this region, in the neighboring countries around Palestine and in Palestine itself. He expelled or led the Hezbollah to defeat the Israeli regime and force it to leave Lebanon in the year 2000. He defeated the Israeli regime in 2006. He helped prevent the NATO dirty war from leading to the planting of black flags over Baghdad and Damascus. He helped defeat the genocidal war on Yemen. And now we see that thanks to him and others, the axis of resistance is a very powerful force that has effectively surrounded the Israeli regime and is killing it or is destroying it by death by 1,000 cuts, effectively. And so he will be sorely missed, but I think the Israeli regime actually miscalculated in a big way. They've made him more popular. They've made Hezbollah more popular across the region and beyond. And even in countries like Iraq, where some Iraqis were indifferent, or at least they were minding their own business and going about with their own lives, they have become outraged. So the Israeli regime has awoken people further, and I think that will have major consequences in the coming weeks and months.
Well, David, we know that Hezbollah's capacities are greater than those of the Lebanese army, but Israel's really going to struggle, isn't it, to mount a successful ground invasion of Lebanon in view of that, isn't it?
I mean, it certainly is. I mean, that's already been the case in these few early days. That there are three ways into Lebanon, effectively three different valleys geographically, and the tanks that they're sending in have to stick to the roads more or less, and that means that they are easy meat for ambushes. And what happens, as I understand it, is that they ambush the tanks, they send up a whole cloud of smoke, and then they start to fire off pre-sighted rockets and RPGs, which destroys large numbers of tanks, and then they come very close and they finish off the IDF, so-called IDF personnel at close quarters. So that's been really very significant in terms of killing large numbers of Israeli soldiers. And we've seen footage of some of that, of helicopters evacuating wounded, all sorts of tall tales being told, though, of the sheer numbers of occupation forces who've been killed. People have been saying 200, 300, but it's not as high as that. But there have been very significant casualties, and they can't find a way through, and that's why they've returned to carpet bombing south of Beirut, and to try and force out many of the Shia Muslims who live in Beirut towards the Syrian border, to try and foster some kind of civil war in Lebanon. That's their aim.
It's almost as if Netanyahu's throwing his troops into a kind of meat grinder.
It is a meat grinder. It's very, very similar, actually. I mean, it's early days, but very similar to what we've seen in Ukraine, where the Zelensky throwing hundreds of thousands of troops into what is an unwinnable position, and they will just be slaughtered.
Yes, indeed. Well, Professor Marandi, Iran has been exercising incredible patience and restraint for a very long time, actually. But that seems to have worn thin now, doesn't it?
Well, if the Israeli regime strikes Iran, I think the response from Tehran will be very painful, and it will be disproportionate. And the regime is very vulnerable and weak, and it is surrounded by nations that despise this ethno-supremacist regime. It will have much more difficulty after an Iranian strike to maintain order and to maintain its domination over the Palestinian people that are being battered by them. So the smart thing for the regime to do would be to refrain from striking, swallow its pride, and just move on. But I doubt that will happen, and therefore they will have to face severe punishment.
Well, David, I mean, Israel said that one of its goals is to return its 70,000 settlers back to the north. But I mean, statements like that are for the birds, aren't they?
Well, it's not going to happen anytime soon. I mean, one can conjecture a time in the future where they are able to foster some kind of civil war which degrades Hezbollah's capacities, and then they could have another conflict with Hezbollah. But that's 5 years from now, at best. So there's no way that they're going to be returning within the next year. That simply isn't going to happen. And of course, all of that makes the the enterprise of the Zionist entity even more creaky because these people have got no jobs, they've got nowhere to go, and they have to be helped at the expense of the state to live in Airbnbs and hotels and bed and breakfasts. So that helps to undermine the ability of the economy to continue.
So this is just hyperbole then, is it, on the part of the
well,
Zionist
they have to have some kind of rhetoric in order to encourage their followers that they're pursuing. And of course, there's a huge pressure on them from the settlers to return to the north. And they're refusing to return unless it's genuinely safe. Right. So that's a real pressure on them.
Sure. Well, Professor Marandi, the response from many Western countries to Israel's actions in Lebanon, I mean, it's laid bare, hasn't it, the so-called rules-based international order?
Western regimes will support the Israeli genocide, the Israeli Holocaust in Gaza, and the genocidal attacks in Lebanon until the last Palestinian and until the last Lebanese child. They will cling to this narrative even if millions are slaughtered. So it is useless to look to the West for any change. They've exposed themselves as barbaric, brutal, and in the eyes of the collective West, the Western regimes, and the Zionist regime, we are all Amalek. We are all inferior to them. And therefore, it is for us to stand up and to beat back this ethno-supremacist regime and to ultimately dismantle it so that Jews, Christians, and Muslims can live in peace and side by side in the land of Palestine.
Time will tell, of course, but I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. So thanks for watching, and thank you to our guest, Professor Marandi, and of course our resident expert, Professor David Miller. You can follow the show on Facebook, Twitter and Telegram, where we post regular clips and updates. And of course our entire back catalogue is available on Rumble too. And if you're dismayed by the corporate media churning out relentless pro-Israel propaganda, just share our content on your social media platforms to provide some balance. So until next time, when I hope you'll join us again on Palestine Declassified, this is Chris Williamson saying bye for now.